As consumers of the arts, we instinctively pay respect to certain works for their influence on the medium. We know that without games like Half-Life or GoldenEye, we wouldn't have games like Halo or Call of Duty. And before them, we acknowledge the influence of games like Doom and Quake. Without the Ultima series, we wouldn't have immersive simulator games like System Shock, Deus Ex, or more recent games like Prey. Due to the gaming medium being so young, it's relatively easy to map the history of a genre or gameplay mechanic from its inception to the modern day. That said, one aspect of game design whose history I and others seem to have a hard time mapping is narrative. At what point did games jump from pure gameplay to a mixture of the two? And when did it go from that to including stories that rival those in other media? We can point to early examples like Metal Gear Solid, Grim Fandango, and others, but as far as I can tell, we don't have a timeline based on influence. Though I do not have the qualifications to construct this timeline on my own, I would like to put forward a couple of nodal points that should be considered. Up until recently, the oldest games I've researched on this channel are Chrono Trigger and I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, both released in 1995. No Mouth was pivotal because it was one of the first games to have an ethics system, where various gameplay decisions affected the story's outcome. Chrono Trigger did the same thing. It was also one of the first to have a story with deep existential themes, ones that were subtle, yet nonetheless present. Now the inevitable question that follows is, was there a game before these two that had these amongst other qualities? One that permitted this type of deep storytelling for all games moving forward. While I believe games like Myst, Phantasy Star, Warcraft, and others were responsible for the inclusion of good stories alongside gameplay, there is one game that I believe mastered the mixture of gameplay and story first. One that served as the archetype for emulation for decades to come. That game is Final Fantasy VI. I'm going to transition into a discussion of this game by addressing a long-standing debate within the Final Fantasy fan community. Which game was the most influential, Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII? In my opinion, if you're asking about the game as a whole, Final Fantasy VII was no doubt more influential. If you're asking in terms of story, it's Final Fantasy VI. I'm not saying that Final Fantasy VI has the best story between 7 or any of the other games, because that's up for debate, even though the objective answer is 9. But my point is that FF6 might have been the insemination point for deep narratives in the medium. Though some might say Final Fantasy IV was more revolutionary, being one of the first games to mix a fleshed out story with a game, it was 6 that not only made that perfect marriage between story and gameplay, but dared to quote-unquote go there with its dark subjects and themes. Things like nihilism, the pain of loss, and other things I can't say out loud without risking demonetization. With this video, I wish to demonstrate to modern audiences why the story of this game had the impact it did, why it was innovative at the time, and why in some ways, it remains innovative to this day. Before I do that, I will provide a very brief synopsis of FF6's story and setting. If you're already familiar with all of that, feel free to skip ahead to the timecode you see on screen. 1,000 years before the events of Final Fantasy VI, 3 gods descended from the heavens to the world below. With this world, each of the 3 gods saw a potential kingdom, but to each of them, this was a kingdom that could not be co-ruled. The 3 warred amongst each other for dominance, going so far as to transform humans and animals into magical automatons called espers, which they would use as soldiers in their armies. After many years of fighting, this warring triad became conscious of the devastating effect the war was having. They were destroying not only the face of this once unblemished world, but in making the humans their soldiers, they took away their free will. Ultimately, the gods ceased their war and returned a sense of will back to the Espers and humans. Then the gods asked the Espers and humans to imprison them in statues, inside a dimension separate from the world they had warred in for so long. They explicitly stated that their statues should be placed in the form of a triangle, in order to balance the unworldly power they shared among them. They warned that if this triadic bond were to ever be broken, the world might end. To prevent anybody from disturbing this bond, the Espers took these statues into this separate dimension, leaving the remaining humans at peace for a millennium. Over those thousands of years, the concept of magic had faded into legend, while technology rose to prominence. As is to be expected, humans sought new and improved forms of technology as fast as they could, so that their ideological opponents might not get them first. Unfortunately, the most power-hungry emperor of them all discovered how to create the ultimate form of weaponry. Emperor Gestahl happened upon the entrance to the dimension the gods and Espers fled to thousands of years ago. With them, he saw an opportunity. He could drain the Espers of their magic and use it to enhance pre-existing technology. The weapons that would be birthed from this fusion of technology and magic would be aptly named Magitech. For the entirety of Final Fantasy VI, we witnessed several competing kingdoms and factions fight back against Gestahl and his minions. And of those kingdoms and factions, we play as several individuals within each of them. Now, because FF6 is a 30-year-old game, inevitably there will be aspects of the story that don't hold up that well, and we'll get to one or two of those in a moment. However, one of the things that does hold up well, and remains quite novel to this day, is the way these playable characters are used to convey the story. See, with most games and most stories, there is almost always a lead character. Take Final Fantasy VII. The stories of Barret, Tifa, Aerith, Red 13, and others all have a great deal of narrative weight. But make no mistake, Cloud is the main character. He is the avatar that the gamer lives vicariously through. The same goes for the majority of FF9 with Zidane and FF10 with Titus. For FF6, however, there is no character that I can point to that can aptly be called the lead character, the avatar. Of the 14 playable characters, the largest cast in any Final Fantasy game ever, the majority of them have equally important narrative roles. And to top things off, FF6 did something with these characters that hadn't really been done in the Final Fantasy series up until that point, or almost any game for that matter. They each had backstories. Sure, Final Fantasy IV did this to an extent, like I said, but even Yoshinori Kitase, the director of Final Fantasy VI, said that 6 was the first time that they were really able to go full throttle. Quote, "The idea was to transform the Final Fantasy characters of the time from mere ciphers for fighting into true characters with substance and backstories who could evoke more interesting or complex feelings in the player. While there is no main character, you will inevitably identify with certain characters over others, and want to play as them more. Thankfully, this game allows you to pick which character you want to play as when you're exploring the world, save for certain sections where you only have certain characters in your party. Brilliantly, the game rewards your attachment to these characters by triggering certain story events depending on which character you're playing as and which location you're in. For example, there is the character Rachel, who you can encounter lying in a bed in a village called Kollingen. Unless you have Locke in your party when you're in this town, you might miss out on a chunk of both Rachel's and Locke's tragic backstory. This goes for several of the other characters, who all have their own tragedies they are dealing with. By choosing to play as these other characters that maybe you're not as fond of, the game not only rewards those characters with more experience points, but story threads that you might have missed otherwise. It's a very clever mixture of gameplay and storytelling, one that has rarely been replicated in any game. Now, in my opinion, if you experience these backstories through a modern lens, the structure and dramatic content of a few of them feel not bad by any means, but elementary, especially compared to subsequent entries in the Final Fantasy series. There are a couple of things to keep in mind though. Obviously, there is no denying the emotional impact these stories had at the time, and needless to say, narrative depth is subjective. Though stuff like the death of Cyan's wife and child didn't hit the way I think it should have, doesn't mean it won't for you. And that's not to say that there aren't a couple of moments that do maintain their emotional resonance. In fact, there's a couple that hit me pretty hard, but we'll discuss those in a few minutes. Despite the simplicity of a few of the backstories, when you add them all together, they all brilliantly inform the game's overarching theme, which again is one that I don't think any game had dared to approach up until 1994, that being the theme of loss. Of the 14 playable characters, the majority of them have lost something very precious to them, something that gave their life meaning. Locke and Setzer lost loved ones. Terra lost her sense of identity. Edgar and Cyan lost entire kingdoms. With these losses, these and other characters are forced to find something to keep living for, one that enables them to carry on, despite the pain they carry in their hearts. Perversely, the war against Emperor Gestahl provided these broken-hearted characters with a sense of purpose. It allowed them to project the resentment they felt about the tragedies in their life onto a convenient scapegoat. While, yes, this isn't made explicit via the game's dialogue, it becomes apparent the more you try to empathize with the characters, and it becomes especially apparent following the game's most cataclysmic event. For the first half of the game, I, and I'm sure many others, believed that Gestahl was the primary villain, pulling everybody's strings from behind the scenes. At the forefront of his villainous schemes, however, was always Kefka, a character that can be precisely described as Final Fantasy's take on the Joker from DC Comics. Like the Joker, Kefka's sole purpose for existence is to sow chaos and misery wherever he can, which he justifies via a nihilistic philosophy. Kefka thinks that if everything is fated to entropy and death, what is the purpose of doing anything positive or constructive? 'Twere better that nothing would begin for this reason. Kefka could have very easily been a one-dimensional, mustache-twirling villain, but the choice to give him this ideology elevated him to one of the most memorable in the series. Not only that, the echoes of his nihilism and resentment are found in all the other most beloved Final Fantasy villains, especially, but not limited to, Seymour from 10, Kuja from 9, and of course Sephiroth from 7. It is on this point that we eventually find that Kefka differs from Gestahl ideologically. Though Gestahl would like to have a world to rule over, Kefka would rather destroy it. This ideological conflict comes to the forefront after Gestahl secured the power of the Warring Triad from the Esper world, a feat that Kefka aided so that he could eventually take the power of the Triad for himself. Kefka knew that if the balance between the three gods was disturbed, his goal of ultimate destruction might be realized, but he would have to act fast. When the main characters arrive to stop Gestahl, he uses the power of the Triad to subdue them, save for the character of Celeste. He does this because Celeste was a general that defected from his army. He was willing to give her another chance, if she killed her fellow party members. Heroically, she refuses the offer and stabs Kefka. Normally, a moment like this would lead the audience to believe that the villain's defeat was imminent. To use a contemporary example, this moment would be like when Thor hit Thanos with his axe at the end of Avengers Infinity War, which made us believe his defeat was imminent. But to the collective surprise of the characters and the gamer, Kefka steps into the middle of the triangle, preparing to move the statues out of alignment. Gestalt tries to stop him, but he is quickly stricken down by the Triad's power. The party members make their own attempt to stop Kefka, but were unable to stop him before he moved the statues. Though they were able to break out of their containment, the unbalanced power of the Triad caused everything in the world to fracture, including their airship, causing them all to fall into the sea below. Despite their best efforts, our heroes lost, and the world had ended. Up until 1994, the only time evil won in a video game is if we failed on account of our own skill, or if we chose to side with evil. With Final Fantasy VI, it doesn't matter what we do, or how hard we try. Evil wins. When people first experienced this back in 1994, the feeling they had was probably akin to the shock a lot of people felt when Thanos won, when he murdered half the universe with the snap of his fingers. Boundaries had been violated. Things that should have been impossible happened. And now that they happened, neither the characters nor the gamer knew what to do. In my case, when the cataclysm happened, I sat completely still, staring wide-eyed at the screen, disoriented and not really knowing what to do next. In a way, my feeling of disorientation is probably similar to what the characters felt. Recall what I said before about why the characters fought against the Empire. So many of them fought in order to have a meaning that would sustain them, despite their immeasurable pain. But they failed. Now, they are left not just disoriented, but with new feelings of loss that compound what they felt before. Up until this point, we had been accustomed to putting ourselves in the shoes of our favorite characters, and thanks to that, we now feel compelled to ask ourselves, what would we do in this situation? Or even better, what should we do? For some, a lack of sustaining purpose in the apocalypse would be too much to bear. In regards to Final Fantasy VI, this was true for Coalesce. Aside from the cataclysm, the other moment that hit me emotionally was, of course, Celeste's act of despair. With this, Final Fantasy VI once again innovated by talking about a subject that never came up in a video game until that point. Not only that, it's a subject that is tragically almost never talked about in any form of media due to its taboo nature. And when it is talked about or used as a plot device, it's often used to shock or disturb. But Final Fantasy VI uses it in a way that pays Nietzschean tribute to the strength of the human will. Not just through story, but just as importantly through gameplay. Celeste survives her attempt, and when she does, she wakes up to see a seagull with a bandana in its mouth that looks a lot like the one that belonged to Locke. This tiny spark of hope, the possibility that he might be alive, sets Celeste on a journey to every part of this new fractured world. From this point on, the game becomes a sort of inadvertent therapy session of sorts. Though you only need Edgar and Setzer to fight Kefka again and finish the game compels you, challenges you, to see how many of your lost comrades you are able to find again. When you do find them, the therapy is extended in a way, because you find out what they did to make life after the apocalypse bearable. You are then compelled to evaluate all of their responses, the pros and the cons, whether you identify with their actions or not at all. And hopefully, you might find an ethic that you can apply to your own life, when and if you are ever in despair. Finding all of them will not be easy. Often you will have to endure great challenges in order to reintegrate your comrades back into your party. The same goes for the weaponry you will need to obtain in order to take on Kefka. In my case, I wanted to demonstrate the quality of my will by finding and retrieving as much as I could, to show that even when everything is broken to pieces, you can still try to pick them up and put them back together. With each rediscovered party member, with each new weapon, I felt a sense of moral and emotional satisfaction that I only recall getting from the Dark Souls games. By defeating what often feels like insurmountable odds, we discover a capacity within ourselves, however small, that we never thought we had. I think this is why, like with people who play Dark Souls, people talk about how Final Fantasy VI helped them emotionally, or how in some cases, it saved their life. It's because both of those games test your will, but they don't make things so difficult that things feel unfair. If you discipline yourself, if you reflect on your faults and where you can do better, you can develop an ethic of self-improvement that will not only help you beat the game, but can maybe be applied to your own life. What game before Final Fantasy VI did this sort of thing? Granted, there were difficult games that tested people's will, but none of them were narratively resonant, at least not as much as 6 was. Its willingness to tackle difficult subject matter and put it in the context of a game was a risk, but the result was the archetype. Though video game stories have become better and deeper compared to Final Fantasy VI in the last 30 years, many of them owe their existence, in part, to this game. And arguably, a story still has yet to come along that structures gameplay and story in the shape and quality that Final Fantasy VI did. Just gotta say one more thing before I conclude. In the past, when I have done videos on Final Fantasy, I normally do an analysis of their mythological content. What are the real-life influences, and can they reveal any secrets? I was going to do that for this video, by talking about stuff like the inspiration for the Warring Triad and Kefka's Tower. However, I felt that including that here would detract from the core message I wanted to convey, so I will be saving that for another video. If you are a fan of Final Fantasy VI, please let me know in the comment section below what other stuff you would like to see in a video about the game's mythology. Also, did FF6 have as profound an impact on your life as it did for others? Let me know in what way. Please give this video a like if you liked it. It's quick, free, and helps me out a lot. If you like the kind of videos I do here, please consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my YouTube members section. I will leave links to those in the description box. Thanks guys, and until next time, stay yellow.